before we dive in, because there is a lot going on in the world, a lot. And I want to start really on a personal level with each of you and asking you, how are you staying centered and grounded as human beings during these trying times?
Okay, so I'll start. And thanks, Victor, and thank you to Upswell, and thanks to Independent Sector just for this opportunity to talk in these times and share ideas and share information with so many people who are working to do, as you said, and create a better world in the world and a country and cities to live up to the values that we so often espouse, but have had some challenges. I think, for me, it is a personal understanding of the long arc of history. And we're in a time of great change, but it's related to the arc of history of all the people who have been fighting prior, all the activities that have been happening before, and all the consciousness and awareness that has come to this point that allows a huge wave of people to acknowledge what many people, and acknowledge the indignities, acknowledge the systemic failures that many of us take for granted every day, and many of us had to live through every day. So I think it's a really good, it's an opportunity. The question will be, what do we make of the opportunity as far as our kind of trek through history? But for me, it's acknowledging that this is another point in that long moral arc of justice that Dr. King talked about, to be able to do the best we can by our fellow
Yeah.
citizens.
Yeah, that's great. So for you, it's centering to know that you're not the first person to be taken on this fight, and
No, not the first rodeo, as some people would say.
or
So.
the last, or the only
Right.
person in this fight. Great.
Yeah, I'll also join in and say gratitude, Victor.
Thanks,
very
Joy.
grateful to be able to be in this virtual space with Candace and Majestic, allies certainly in the work across the nation. I'll say for me in Minneapolis, I don't know that I necessarily am staying centered and grounded. As a human being, I strive to every day. I strive to find and focus on those places of hope in this moment. But also, I think part of what helps me stay a bit more in my humanity is the reminder that these are really challenging times. I appreciate Majestic's reference back to the long arc of justice. This is not short-term work, and those of us who commit to doing it do commit to doing the long-term work, but even in times that are particularly challenging, I strive to operate with a sense of grace towards myself and the reminder to be gracious towards myself and towards others in this moment, and trying to maintain some reasonable expectation of myself, but then also remembering that when it does become more overwhelming, that sometimes I do have to turn off the Zoom call and go sit outside for a little bit, or hop on my bike, or I bake, so I maybe bake something, but just, getting in touch with the things that do provide me with some level of distance and space from the pressure of the time here and there, so that I can grow some capacity and come back in and re-engage.
Thanks,
Yeah, and I'd also say thank you to everyone, and sort of, I think a center like right between Majestic and Joy. I don't know if I'm center. I don't know if that's where I am right now. I strive for it. I think when I am confronted, there was a time here, I'll say, that I just felt like the world was shifting weekly, if not on some days daily, some days not hourly. And just when you thought you had kind of assessed and gotten a handle on what you were sort of experiencing one day, then, another round would come. And that is, I'd like to pretend that I was graceful in handling that, but, and even if not outwardly, I would say in my head, it was it was a lot. And I think it's important to just be honest about that, to not try to position myself as some sort of superhero in all of this. I finally got to the point where I would just sort of, when people sort of instinctually ask you, how are you doing? I started to get real honest. I was like, I'm not okay. I mean, I'm physically okay. I'm eating, I'm sleeping, I'm doing the requisite things, but I am not okay. And this is not okay. And it's okay for us to say that. But if anything can ground me in this moment of all of this, I think what I look to are the types of things that Majestic sort of laid out, is that I'm not the only one experiencing this. I'm not the only one that has ever experienced this. We do this work, we sit in this moment alongside many others, and I have to figure out what my job is, and I have to do it well, because me doing that allows the next person, either alongside of me or after me, to then have what they need for whatever they need to do. So I try to get real, sometimes compartmentalized, just to try to navigate through these spaces. And that's what at least gives me an anchor to kind of make it through the next day, sometimes next hour.
Yeah, I know, and I appreciate that point, Candace. It doesn't seem like it ever lets up, and even with everybody on high alert about issues at stake, the violence continues, and the disappointments seem to keep piling up. And so we are absolutely in a moment of great disequilibrium, and there might be a second to Joy's point where you might feel like, okay, let me just appreciate that moment, but then we are getting pushed to and fro, both by so many things, so I understandably, kind of one of there's a tremendous, as we all know, there are a tremendous amount of protests taking place on a sustained basis across the country. And one source of energy fueling those protests is the pent-up impatience of folks who want to see real, irrefutable, irreversible change, and have had it with what can feel like the dreadfully slow or incremental pace of typical governmental change or reform. Now, I as you all know, have served in local government, and so I know from firsthand experience the kind of sweeping change that is possible. But I also appreciate that in many ways, government was designed to move deliberately, and that can be a source of great frustration, not just outside of government, but within government as well. And so from where you sit, what do you see as some of the unique challenges that staff have in pushing for racial equity from within government?
So I'm happy to jump in. So as the director of the Division of Race and Equity, I serve in that Chief Equity Officer role. I saw that there was a question in the chat, like, what exactly does that person do? And so it's a work of my division, similarly to the work that Majestic and Candace do, which is really working across the city enterprise to help both develop and implement an agenda that advances racial equity in our policy and our practice. Some of the challenge that we have in staff of doing that, particularly as a Black woman leading this work with a team that is predominantly made up of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as staff who identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, is that when we're in these moments, when we're really confronted at the worldwide level about the deep pain of structural racism, and you're showing up in a body that's also living under the oppression of structural racism, trying to do your work, trying to maintain some sense of your own humanity and honoring your own individual needs in this moment, as well as being a resource to an organization that, from Minneapolis's perspective, is responding and reacting very swiftly. Unlike, government typically moving very slowly, very deliberately, we're in a place where there is so much local outcry for transformation with a very highly active constituency generally, compounding that with the worldwide amplification of the value of Black lives and of systems needing to be responsive. Like, so we're moving very, very quickly on top of a time when we're already responding and stretched very thin and addressing COVID and the impact of COVID, as well as balancing the struggle and the financial impact of budgetary constraints as a result of income loss. So all of those factors coming together, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of challenge, both individual, both from community, from those of us who are working inside of City Hall as people of color, or who are deeply connected to community groups who are showing up on various sides of the issues around policing, and then also with an enterprise agenda that's broadly focusing on equity for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as for those who identify as transgender and gender nonconforming. We're also reminded that while policing and community safety is a critical topic to be focusing on right now, the challenges of structural racism are so deeply intersectional that we can't just focus on one area. We still have a responsibility to the broader swath of ways in which the ways in which government exacts violence and harm on BIPOC communities on a daily basis.
I'll just say what Joy said.
Huh.
All of that, all of that.
Yeah, well, it's hard to come behind that. I think for me, the challenge is, you know, what people don't realize about the nature of the systems. There are a lot of people within systems who fundamentally think that the systems are not biased, who fundamentally think that the systems are not leveled and stacked against populations, who fundamentally think that their work is done in a colorblind manner, so to speak. And so you have well-meaning people who often sometimes are the slowest to change because they're, in their minds, their work is benefiting everyone, but may not see how the systems before them have framed their narratives around this work so that it actually is harming people, although they can't see it. And that's an important thing around training, because what you often have is a lot of people like us who are on things like this, you know, waxing eloquently, but then you have a lot of middle managers and a lot of folks that are in systems who don't get why this stuff is important. And we know that, as Joy said, in the enterprise is made up of so many people. Yeah. And often there's, you know, there can be a break between what folks understand kind of in senior roles and what the person that's doing the work in, you know, in public works to identify what parks get mowed, or what streets get paved, or where the bus shelters are. I mean, these are very practical things that continue to impact people in ways that re-traumatize them and set them up for a narrative to say that my neighbor is not as important, I'm not as important, which continues that system, which then also makes them, when they get ability to leave, they do, which then, you know, which is flight and disinvestment, which continues this kind of model, right? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, not that even cities collectively, the collective we get that we have to change. There's enough reports and stuff out to say that. Yeah. But the practicality of how you change within systems and get the enterprise to move from leadership as well as folks who are within the enterprise and making the enterprise move.
Yeah, and you've all touched on that. These systems are ingrained at levels that are sometimes much less than obvious, right? Some things are very obvious, but some things feel small, but as you said, have a serious impact on lives. And when that occurs in areas where you don't happen to access that service or use that bus stop or ride that bus, you know, depend on the buses, you don't see this. And ultimately all of these little and large decisions are a reflection of policy. And if we're going to be anti-racist as a society, then we've got to be anti-racist in our policies, because policy has facilitated racism, and it's policy that enshrines or protects racism. So I want to invite you all to touch on the role of, so you started this, but maybe expound a little bit more on the role of the chief equity officer in advancing policy change, and then invite you to share one community level policy change that you think could advance equitable outcomes at the municipal level, which is where you're operating. And then if you don't mind then being a little larger and think about if there was one lever that you could pull if it was either at the state level or at the federal level of another policy change that would help us with bend that arc of history, Majestic, that you reminded us of. So again, this is kind of to all of you, anyone who wants to jump in, but this issue of policy, like what is a policy that you'd like to see changed or are working hard to change now at the local level, and what is an idea at the state or federal level that you'd like to see changed?
Yeah, I'll start off and I'll actually give and talk a little bit about even it's sort of like a micro policy issue that I think kind of has some macro level implications. So in my role, I sit within our mayor's office, and to understand the moment here, I see, so there's a few shout outs from Chicago, so some folks kind of will know what I'm talking about, is that we're in a real moment in Chicago to move some equity work in ways that I don't think we have been, I'll say at least for a while. In values, there's a lot of alignment. There's a lot of alignment at the city level. There's a lot of value alignment at the community level, at the state level, county level. So I think we're in a real moment. I think what that moment, though, is challenged by and especially as we have dealt with COVID and we've dealt with some of the protests, and a sense of urgency that I think can, if we are not careful, can lead to quick, less thoughtful, less intentional equity work. Because what we fundamentally have to be thinking about is systemic change, and to the points that were kind of made earlier, that is not something that is a quick win, right? That is not something that's low-hanging fruit. That's not something that we turn around program by program or initiative by initiative, right? That's deep work. And so trying to do deep work in a moment of intense urgency is a different kind of challenge. And recognizing that people are at the table and motivated for lots of different reasons. You know, there's a sense of, I want to get through this crisis. And so people may be motivated to sort of say yes, allow for some things, but it's not, you know, it's a now type of thing. There are some folks who have been waiting for this moment, right? And have a whole deep plan, and it's really robust, but, you know, trying to fit it into the moment can be a challenge. And so I think as a chief equity officer, one of the challenges of this moment is to try to help conduct a lot of that, to recognize what is, to try to sync things up, in some cases bat things away, to take on a lot there. An example in particular is we are doing a lot of work of trying to build funds for recovery efforts. Recovery from the impact of COVID, recovery from some of the destruction that has surrounded some of the protests. And one of the things that I think we've been pushed to think about and try to deliver on is what are we trying to recover, you know, in terms of what we lost? Is the goal just to get back to where we were before, or is this indeed an opportunity to think deeper about where we could and where we want to be? And this is not just coming from us in City Hall, this is coming from our communities that are saying, when you start offering funds, I want you to think about who gets those and how they're distributed in our communities. And how do we not recreate some of the challenging things that existed in our communities to begin with? How does this catalyze a different kind of opportunity that is built from the ground up with inclusion and equity and fairness? And so building that and thinking about that even as part of your funding eligibility requirement seems super micro, but deeply important, because there are all sorts of resources that the city sets eligibility requirements around. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is to make sure that what we build in one place with deep intention actually then carries over to the next funding opportunity. So if our Department of Housing is working on something and has done some deep thinking, how do I connect to them and support the next agency that also needs to think about resources that they're about to deploy, so that we are building this on top of each other and benefiting from that, so from that intentional thinking. And I think that does have to trickle all the way up. You know, I want to certainly see it at the city level, but we need that sort of coordination and thought and anchoring at our county levels, our state levels, recognizing that we're going to be in a state of repair and recovery, but it's not, you know, it can be a great opportunity to try to move some work that hasn't been able to move before if we are intentional about it.
Thank you, Candace.
So I think just to kind of add on to what Candace is saying, yeah, one of the challenges is that I think in looking at equity work and looking at creating equitable outcomes, right, that people are looking for something now, right? Because you're saying you've dedicated yourself as a city to this work.
Yep.
And for some people, they're saying, okay, we'll change this, we'll change that. And as all three of us know, and you know, Victor, changing a program or one policy in itself, it can be self-gratifying, but it's not necessarily the long-term systemic change you want to see. So being asked to think about what are the wins and what empower people in communities to see that their community is physically changing, right? That the public goods they're receiving are those that they feel are equal or, you know, appropriate to their communities, while also understanding that the means of how those resources get to them, the broader policies and the agendas of how all of our departments do work, becomes the other thing that is often really unseen. And for the vast majority of our residents, except for maybe some stakeholders and activists, that's inside baseball. So it's like, how do you do the good inside baseball work? And at the same time, you're still doing the very practical work of showing people that they matter. And part of how people understand that they matter is how do they respond to those public goods that for so many decades, you know, they have not had access to in the same manner, right? So I think that becomes the challenge when you look at, you know, community level things that we have made a shift on. I mean, I would see a number of things that I would argue, you know, even down to things, and I use these kind of micro elements, but like paving, like for years, the Black communities in Pittsburgh would just not get paved at the same level. And actually they would take CDBG money and spread the CDBG money out equally to all neighborhoods in the city when all neighbors in the city didn't have the same problem. And this was something that was done for decades, right? Based on budget constraints and budget decisions, until this administration really making a decision that no, it's going to be done on the places with the most need. And what does that mean sometimes? It means some of our very affluent districts don't get many streets paved in a year, right? And it means that if some of our neighborhoods that did not receive that, they get a lot of streets paved.
Yeah.
Now, for some people, that's relatively small because it does not destroy racism, right? But for the resident in a neighborhood who has been so used to not receiving the public good that is owed to them, right? It's a huge deal, and it shifts the way that our directors, and I want to give a shout out to our director, Karina Ricks, of our mobility and infrastructure, really having that mind state along with the mayor to say, no, we have to go to those most in need. We have to go to the areas most in need, and we have to kind of set that precedent to acknowledge that the city is working to do that while we're having a conversation around all departments and making sure that all departments are going through racial equity training, racial equity toolkits, engaging to talk about these larger issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really that balance of that deep thinking and that reimagining, and also that real time need that communities still have. And I think we should be careful never to disconnect ourselves from the real practical need that communities have. And that when they're speaking out about things that may seem secondary or tertiary, that they're very primary to them, and that we need to respond to those things as well as we're trying to think about the deep work.
Yeah, thanks, Majestic. So, Joy, you earlier referenced the sweeping change that's already underway, or at least under consideration in Minneapolis. Can you just tell us a little bit about what's happening now in Minneapolis? And some of it is immediately responsive to activities of recent weeks, but can you also add to, you also flag the importance of remembering that we need to be responsive, and that there's big opportunity in being responsive, but we've also got to do blocking and tackling across another set of issues that perhaps aren't perceived as being responsive. But can you give us a feel for what's happening in Minneapolis?
Sure. So I would say it's both our city council in the form of a resolution that they passed this past Friday and an announcement that's come separately from our mayor's office. Both those legislative bodies have identified a commitment in the near term and in the long term to engaging community and other partners outside of the city in really understanding what opportunities we have to make transformational change within community safety and with policing in the city of Minneapolis. They've been very forthright and very quick in naming the moment and in wanting to be intentional about how we are seizing this opportunity to see what it is that we can do to right wrongs by looking at our relationship with the Police Federation, for example, by looking at opportunities to focus more on community-based safety strategies. We've been able to bear witness to an enormous grassroots organizing inside of our communities in providing support to one another and ensuring the accessibility of just daily needs. When our buses were shut down due to the protests, or when as grocery stores, particularly in some of our neighborhoods that are already feeling or enduring a scarcity of access to good foods, community members coming together, leveraging donations coming out from across the metro area and helping to build some of those more organic grassroots models around community safety and about providing for one another, both in the form of physical safety for property, but also for food and other sorts of household needs. So I would say from a City Hall perspective, our response in those moments are thinking about what our policy opportunities are, specifically around community safety and policing. But I would say in addition to that, how are we also listening to the needs of community? How are we lifting up and honoring what community is already building and finding additional ways to partner with them and to sustain them? As an example, like there are staff in my office who have been daily out in community working with some of these community organizations and individuals who are imagining new ways for them to create community-led co-ops and grocery stores to do more emergency planning on a long-term basis so the community has a way to be more resilient when crisis strikes them. So there are some opportunities that are emerging both at the kind of big P policy level led by our legislators in the city, but also I would say with our residents as well. Those of us, like, so for me, working in the Division of Race and Equity, trying to maintain that keen sort of broad scale perspective of what all of the opportunities look like and making sure that as we move that work forward, we don't lose sight of some of those core processes that we're looking to standardize in the city, like our racial equity impact analysis. How are we making sure the decision making, even in this moment of crisis, when we can be quick to react, that we're also pausing and reflecting on the impact of some of these near-term decisions on Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And how are we also not losing sight of our strategic and racial equity action plan, which has 7 policy priority areas, so that even as we're making decisions around our workforce, for example, as it relates to income or revenue loss due to COVID, or how we're making decisions around how we're spending dollars, or how we're making decisions around supporting renters and ensuring that they're not displaced, keeping a keen eye on the goals and the priorities that we've set in our strategic and racial equity action plan throughout that process, so that we're not just reacting in a very narrow focus, but keeping that broad perspective. That's largely the role of my division, I would say, to keep elevating that conversation within the organization, but then also recognizing the immense pressure that everybody is under in the low capacity that many of us are working in. So to be able to be really active partners with our staff and with our community in order to make sure that we're able to move forward and accomplish the goals and live up to the values that we've stated.
Yeah, and I'm curious, the governments are also under economic pressure as a result of the COVID and just the general collapse in tax revenues and other things. And has that shown up in the ability of you to advance your work in any of your cities?
Well, I know Minneapolis, we're actually in the process now of working through a revised budget for 2020. We're definitely expecting a significant impact. I think the last projected number I heard was a budget shortfall of $165 million for 2020. And so how do we begin to reimagine what our budget looks like? I think the budget is any jurisdiction, any municipality's largest policy lever. And so that is a very key opportunity for us to reflect our values. And when we're facing a budget shortfall, it does provide some major constraints upon us and how it is we live up to that value.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say for us, we're expecting, the idea is around 20% of our budget will be affected by COVID. So we're looking to have to make those decisions while at the same time kind of making decisions around shifting resources from public safety and some police work specifically, as well as some other work things that are happening. So we do have that challenge of what does this look like to have the kind of impact we need to have on people, when right now we're still receiving federal funds, or federal funds are still in play. We don't know how that will look in the next round of resources, and specifically going to cities that, for Pittsburgh, being smaller than 500,000 people, that Pittsburgh did not receive kind of money in that first tranche. We did obviously receive the CARES money that we directed to the issues and challenges that we saw impacting our most vulnerable communities from top to bottom, whether it was rent stabilization, food, working with our newcomer community around resources that didn't have access to some of the traditional kind of nonprofit structures. So I think some of it will remain to be seen. That will be the challenge of later this year going into next year, where you have a budget cut of maybe 20%, and at the same time increased need.
Yeah.
And then thinking about how do you find those resources, and where can you be strategic in being resilient and maybe cutting, and where do you need to enhance, but also thinking through in the most way, where do you get really the greatest impact to touch on people's lives when you're redirecting or reallocating resources for the benefit of doing these things, and making sure that there are no unintended consequences, or at least trying to minimize the unintended consequences from that activity.
Candace?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be in similar challenges as well when it comes to the budget, which is no surprise. I do want to jump off of the point that Majestic made about cuts, though. I think, the way I've been thinking about it is that now is the time for us to get real clear about our values. I mean, there's going to be, when it comes to a budget, so much of what you value as a city is embodied in that. And there are going to be difficult choices that have to be made. There are going to be all sorts of different things that we're going to look at. And part of it, what it calls us to do is to get clear about how we're going to allocate money, where it's going to go, where are our values at. And so I think there's a sort of a rigor that needs to be needs to happen as we move into the budget. I will say what somewhat has been interesting, and I do think there's some good credit to give here, is in the recovery efforts. There has been sort of an all hands on deck moment when it comes to trying to solve some of the challenges. It's interesting what crisis sometimes can produce. It can kind of move a lot of stuff out of the way. I will give a lot of credit to our public health department, because I think they had an infrastructure at place that allowed us to really assess where the greatest impact was happening. And that became a compass to try to usher resources in a very targeted fashion to those communities. One of the things that has happened around COVID is that I've been asked, alongside with our Deputy Mayor of Education and Human Services, to lead a racial equity rapid response team that has developed sort of a hyper-local engagement with leaders from our most impacted communities. And our goal is to drive resources to try to mitigate impact. And it's city resources, it's private hospital resources, it's philanthropy resources, and the amount of folks that we've been able to get to the table to really have this hyper-focused mission. It's sort of amazing how fast government can move when it needs to, or when it's called to. What I'm trying to do is make sure that the things that we learned about how and why to meet a need in this moment don't live and die in this moment. That they actually carry out and guide us as we continue to think about the longer haul systemic work that we need to continue to move.
Thanks, Kay. You touched on philanthropy, and so at Upswell in the independent sector, we do a lot of work, and our members and many of those in this audience work in either philanthropy or the nonprofit sector. Can you share either ways in which you're working now with philanthropy and the nonprofit sector in the racial equity work that you're doing writ large, whether it's in response to this particular moment or just more broadly, and also are there ways that you wish or ways that the nonprofit or philanthropy sectors could help you more?
Yeah, so I'll just speak a little bit more about this racial equity rapid response, which I see as a partnership between government, community-based organizations, and largely healthcare providers, and really has been tapping some of the resources and capacity that they have to show up in this moment and provide support and resources, as well as, and then I think there's a good deal of our work that has been working alongside of philanthropy, as government has sort of taken on some of the issues and the needs, and a lot of our philanthropic organizations have been in deep partnership with us, and also meeting some of the areas that government is just not reaching. So with the racial equity rapid response, I think one of the powers of it is that we set this up to be an initiative that allows for true co-creation. So I think the tension has been is that everybody is like, Candace, so what's your 5-point plan for how you're going to move through this? And the dissatisfying answer I give to everyone is that I don't have one. And that's okay, because what I have are leaders who are living through this right now, who are experiencing this on the ground. What I have is institutions that have resources, that have tons of knowledge. And what I have is faith that somewhere in our work together and our push and our tension and our talking and addressing addressing, that we're actually going to name the things that need to happen and that we have the power to execute on it. And I am so proud of the work that we've been able to accomplish, because we've done just that. We've gotten resources in places that need them the most, that haven't gotten them fast enough. We've taken some of the things that we've been learning and talking about together and actually pushed it out to some of the other bodies of work that are in the city government, across the mayor's office. This includes where we put testing sites, where we think about quarantine and isolation, partnerships around food access. And we have done this in relatively short order, right? So I think there's incredible power when you sort of say there's this moment of urgency. We're going to get the right people at the table and the right resources at the table, and then we're going to work together to solve it. And it's okay if we don't have all the answers right now when we start. It's actually probably better that we don't, because there's definitely some limitations. And then on the, I'll just add, Chicago's really rich in a lot of sort of philanthropic networks. And one of the things that I've been proud of is the way in which the city has been able to partner with some of those networks to actually deliver and co-create some of the funds that are being generated. So we can sort of give a view in and sort of share out with some of the things that we're seeing and that we're learning, and saying, you know, a real need is here. How can folks sort of organize to meet this need? And oh, by the way, you should talk to these folks over here, because they are telling us this. You could talk to them as well. And so I think
helping to connect them to others that.
Right. And a lot of them are all, there's a good number that are already in deep relationship. Yeah. And so it is a back and forth. I won't profess to say that government's got it all right all the time, but that philanthropy has it all right all the time. And then oftentimes there are just blind spots for communities that don't give them the viewpoint to see how things could better connect up. And so I'm just a fundamental believer in the power of proximity, and the ability to actually resource our partnerships, not only with dollars, but with information, with power around choices, so that we can deliver on the things that we need to deliver on.
Thanks, Candace. I want to turn to questions from our audience. There are a couple questions asking about youth voice, and that youth, particularly in disinvested communities, have been hit hard by COVID, in addition to having to being in disinvested communities, and yet, so like, it's important that their voice be part of this moment, and they are participating in many of the protests. But what are you doing to ensure that youth voice is at the table, and any advice for youth looking to play a role in this moment or in your work?
So for me, and for us, our My Brother's Keeper coordinator for Pittsburgh and Allegheny County works directly with me in order to kind of try to look into engaging that youth voice. And one of the big things that we were working on prior, but then has become a bigger issue, frankly, now, is what does youth voice look like for the future of how we frame things. So we've had a couple of actual virtual sessions with different youth, trying to bring to folks and bring to the table to say, what are some of the challenges that youth are having right now? Often we talk to youth, or we get information from organizations that run youth groups, but we don't hear from them directly, which could be almost the most impactful. So we've started that, and actually we'll have like a commission of sorts of youth from around the city and county, Black and brown, as well as other folks, just really kind of talking about, okay, you know what, to center us, what does centering us look like? Here are the things that are important from us. So this is sped up, frankly, our need and moment of urgency, as Candace has said, to do that. So while just talking to them, also lifting up the voice. And I think that's that's always a process because having worked in youth organizations and in that sector, it's often very separate. And sometimes people will claim young people as their young people. So when you're like talking to young people and saying, would you like to be a part of a broader context of organizing and mobilization, people are often a little sensitive about that. But we're working through it with many of the groups that we talk to really get youth together and elevate that voice.
Mm-hmm. I would say with Minneapolis, we have a youth coordinating board that are really good partners for us with the school system. So the city of Minneapolis does not have jurisdiction over our local school system, and our youth coordinating board provides a very helpful bridge for us between the city, our park board, our school district, and other youth serving organizations in the metro area. And so that organization is represented pretty actively in a lot of our planning and our strategizing, both around COVID and even in this moment. Certainly as we begin to imagine and plan out what our engagement is going to look like around understanding new strategies around community safety, definitely seeing opportunity to include youth within that specific context. Our council member, Fleet Cunningham, is definitely a strong advocate for youth and youth engagement. Our health department also does a lot of really intentional work in engaging youth. And so I anticipate either directly in our engagement or through the work of collaborative partners that there will be spaces created for youth to have voice, both in the existing processes that we have, largely as reflected on past experience that we've had moving really key broad policy types of things like this.
Yeah. So we've talked about at many levels about the change, and Majestic started us out with the notion that there's a long arc here, that this is going to take time. It's taken time, and it's going to take time. And Candace reminded us that there is this desire to be super responsive to this moment, and we need to do that. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there's a lot of deep work, right? That there's hundreds of years of infrastructure that got built up around supporting racism, making it invisible. We talked about how some people don't recognize the infrastructure for good or ill that is around us. So that's some infrastructure that's been built up over time. And we talked about being resource constrained, and certainly there's a place for money, and whether that's targeted government investment, targeted philanthropic investment. What are the kind of this is from one of the questions too, but are there ways to drive this work forward that aren't just about dollars in, results out? Like what are some of those levers that don't feel as tightly sensitive to funding in your minds?
I would say from my perspective in Minneapolis, and I think Candace spoke to this earlier, and if she didn't intend to, it's what I picked up for what she was saying. One of the key things that we also need to be thinking about is that policy only gets us so far. We have to also be highly attentive to the culture change that needs to happen inside of organizations. How are we deepening our capacity to understand anti-racist principles, how we individually, I know Majestic spoke to this as well, regardless of our role inside of an organization, we have the ability to deeply influence more racially equitable outcomes and more justice in our work. And so how are we equipping staff to have that understanding? And I would also offer to that within our community, as we're engaging community, hopefully in a very co-creative process around developing policy, that we're taking the time and making the investment to grow their capacity as well. How are we helping them to better understand how government works? How are we helping them to understand anti-racist practices as well? How are we investing in the deep healing work that needs to happen? Because every single person, regardless of your body, shows up to work or to some community meeting, into City Hall, wherever it is that you are, holding a lot of racialized trauma. All of us are, regardless of who we are. And so part of that work of bringing greater healing and getting to more equitable outcomes has got to include a level of intentionality and investment in that. Not just a quick box check, not just say, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of silence, and then we act like we're all ready and our nervous systems are prepared to have this really deep conversation, because it's not. So how do we, in an effort to create greater trust and understanding, invest intentionally in doing some of that deep healing work? It's certainly something my division has been very intentional in doing over the last few years. We've invested significant resource in expanding staff capacity around embodied anti-racism practices, and recognize what that's doing for us as an institution, but also the need for more of that to be happening more broadly inside of the city as well as outside of the city, as with our constituents.
Thanks, Joy. Yeah, Candace?
Yeah, I was going to say I would double what Joy was saying. The way I've been thinking about it is one of the needs is around building / rebuilding / strengthening, whatever you want to use there, the civic infrastructure, because there is inequity in who participates in government, who has power in government, who helps inform and who shapes government, who shapes not just government, but all sorts of major choice points that sort of ultimately impact our society. And this is a moment, and one of the things I've seen is in crisis, we have needed that civic infrastructure. That has been the way we have tried to understand gaps, to understand places that we are not hitting. We have relied on that infrastructure to get resources out to community members. And so what if that wasn't there, right? What happened when it wasn't strong enough? To me, we saw how difficult it was to get information to people who were disconnected, who didn't have a relationship with City Hall, but then even worse, may not have had relationship with anyone else adjacent. If we couldn't send the message, could one of our partners send the message? And there's still folks we're not meeting that way. So that civic infrastructure is going to be vital for so much of the work. To me, you cannot do equity work without deep engagement work and community engagement work. It just doesn't work. Otherwise, you are just, sitting with quote unquote experts or leaders, making a lot of assumptions about communities and what they need, and trying to fix things for people instead of fix things with people. So you need that both for the crisis moment, you need that for the long intentional transformation moment. And so we've got to be intentional about investing in that, creating opportunities, raising real choice points. Community engagement is not just telling people, hey, this is what I'm doing, isn't it a great idea, right? But it's also not committing things you can't cash on, that you can't deliver on. So it's being real about where the choice points are, and then pushing yourself to actually make real choice points and get into relationship with community members and build what you need to build.
Thanks, Candace. I regret deeply, because there are more questions and there are so many layers to this, but I regret that we are out of time for this session. Thank you all for making the time, for putting in the time in the work that you do, but also for sharing out with those in our audience how we might invest our time in support of the work that you're doing, and reminding us that money is an important part of this, and we should advocate in whatever role we have to help support those targeted investments. But as Candace pointed out, there's just a lot more to it than just money, and this issue of civic infrastructure, which some of which will involve money, and some of which is about time and access. Just there's a lot that we can do. So. God, I don't want to let you guys go, but but I know you have other things, important things to do. So thank you, Joy. Thank you, Majestic. Thank you, Candace. I hope to be able to pick up this conversation again at some point with you all later this year.